Corruption. Corruption can be devastating to a society. What measures are needed to counteract it? Is it even possible to get rid of corruption? What can you do at a local level to build trust, to strengthen leaders? That and much more are we going to talk about today. Welcome. My name is Anna Bellman. I work as a moderator in Sweden, and I have the pleasure of hosting this talk that we are going to have. And I have three guests with me. Welcome, Måns Svensson, Cecilia Berglin, Björn Möller. Måns, you're associate professor at Lunds University. One of your research areas are corruption, and you also work with two different projects in Uzbekistan and Vietnam. What would you say are the biggest problems with corruption?
In my research group, we try to understand corruption from a sociology of law perspective, which means that we try to see what role law can play in both to secure corruption and to work against corruption. And that is, of course, a bit surprising to say that law can play a negative role in relation to corruption. But law is a different thing in different countries. In Sweden, for example, we are a democracy and we are a country with a high level of rule of law. And the legal culture in Sweden is a result of that. In other countries around the world, the situation is different, and you have another way of governing countries. So the main problem to me with corruption would probably be that it undermines rule of law. And rule of law is one of the cornerstones in both democracy and human rights. But another problem is also that the concept of corruption plays out differently on different levels of society. On a global level, corruption is something. It's negotiated between all countries in the world where, of course, power plays a role. Some countries are more powerful than others, and we get the definition of corruption from this international scene and those international corporations. And the international most recognized definition of corruption is that it is the abuse of power for private gain. The problem with that definition is that abuse is something different in different legal cultures and in different cultures, nations around the world. So therefore, what's needed is a perspective where you can understand corruption from different levels of society. Of course, you need the global, the international perspective, but you also need to understand the specific national context that you are trying to understand corruption within. And perhaps from a researcher's perspective, one of the most under-researched levels is the local level. We have too little understanding scientifically of how corruption plays out in reality on a local level, in the everyday life, where people meet each other, interact, and get their services from society, and so forth. And our ambition is working in Uzbekistan and in Vietnam at the moment, but also in other countries, is actually to try to understand different local levels and build knowledge around how we can create strategies against corruption on a local level.
But it seems hard to work at the global level when the differences are so big between countries.
The global level is also a level where people interact, where people talk to each other and they form treaties and they negotiate. And so it's different in the way that the scene is different, but it's still people.
And it's important.
Yeah, the national level is a little bit different because that's to a high degree, the laws become very, very important. And the laws are path dependent. They are built upon traditions within each country, and that in itself creates a unique situation.
Cecilia Berglin, you're a senior advisor at the Swedish Association of Local Authorities and Regions, SALAR, and you're working with issues concerning human rights and fight against corruption. What would you say are the major problems with corruption?
Firstly, the work against corruption is of fundamental importance for society. And we in the public sector work on behalf of the citizens, and we need to uphold confidence for the public administration. Corruption leads to several risks: economic risks, political risks, and social risks. On the political level, as Måns said, corruption is a major obstacle to democracy and rule of law. And if institutions lose their legitimacy, that's a real problem. And it also can corrode the social fabric in a society and undermines people's trust in the political system. And also economically, corruption depletes national wealth. It hinders development of fair markets and distorts competition. So there's a lot of problems on different levels. Before I finish, I will tell you a little about the organization that I represent as a background for the things we're going to talk about later. I work for SALAR, which is the Swedish Association of Local and Regional Authorities. And it's an independent association, which is both an employers' organization and an organization that represents and advocates for local governments in Sweden. And all of the municipalities and regions are members, although it's voluntary. A few words about Sweden. It's about 10 million inhabitants, maybe you know. There are 290 municipalities and 20 regions. And the biggest municipality is Stockholm with 2 million inhabitants, and the smallest is Björn with 2,800 something inhabitants. So it differs a lot, and that has impact on the way the corruption occurs as well, as we come back to later. There are about 1.2 million people in Sweden working within the regions and municipalities, which makes SALAR the largest employer organization in Sweden. That, of course, gives us the incentive to work with such an important question as corruption. I think
And as you said, we are quite good in Sweden when it comes to corruption. If we look at the Corruption Perception Index by Transparency International, Sweden shares the 4th place.
First, we can say that the Transparency Perception Index is a perception index, so we don't know for sure, but we think that Sweden has quite low level. But why? It's a really difficult question. Yes, the researchers will agree to that. One of the answers that is often lifted is the principle of public access to official documents, that anybody, inhabitants, citizens, can go to the municipality or the region and request for documents that are held by the authority or sent to the authority. Of course, that helps to the authorities has to be transparent, and the journalists get an insight which can help to expose irregularities. So that could be one factor. There
are many more.
There are many more factors, but that transparency is an important factor.
Björn Möller, you're the Quality Assurance Manager at ICLD. You work at the Knowledge Center, where you work with supporting research into local democracy, but you also work with internal quality assurance. What do you see as the main problem with corruption?
Well, without repeating too much of what my co-panelists have already said, I think I would just like to underline the issue of trust. I think that is one of the biggest damages that corruption is doing to societies. I mean, corruption is something that it's unfair, it's undemocratic, it hurts societies, hurts businesses, it sidelines healthy competition, like you pointed out. It leads to poor quality in public services and also in private services. And for the ICLD, we try to focus what we do on 4 different so-called core areas. So we work with equity, participation, transparency, and accountability specifically. And I mean, corruption goes pretty much against all of those core values. But I would also like to point out another problem with corruption, and that is that it's, in a way, understandable. It's a very human thing, corruption. It doesn't necessarily take a lot of ill will to end up in a corrupt situation. And at the individual level, I think it can be, don't get me wrong, but it can be an effective way to work, and it can be a rational option sometimes. It can be a nice thing to do, to return a favor to someone who did a favor to you in the past, and sometimes.
So the intentions can be good.
The intentions can be good. You can be corrupt in a way, but still work for the good of society. And sometimes the rules and regulations are a bit difficult to know in detail, and you may find that you act corrupt without even knowing it almost. And so I would say a problem is that regular people can end up in situations where corrupt behavior is triggered. So that is just to add to what's already been said.
Is that something we should be afraid of? That all of us can be in a corrupt situation?
I think we're maybe not afraid, but we should be aware. Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yes, I agree, but at the same time I'm sitting here thinking that this is somewhat a Swedish perspective, because in some societies, when we talk about corruption here, it's rather perhaps informal economy. And the informal economy is crucial for those societies, where you cannot have health care, you cannot send your kids to school, you cannot get a salary if you are a teacher, if you don't involve in the informal economy. So it's I think what's needed is to for one, separate grand corruption from petty corruption. So they need to be treated differently and viewed differently. And then you have corruption that is actually survival strategies. So when you are in a situation where you are your own life or your children's life are at risk, then it's not possible to not be involved in the informal economy. From a legal point of view, being involved in the informal economy would count as corruption. But if you are living in a society where law and welfare does not work as smoothly as it does in Sweden, it's really difficult to put the blame on the individual. It's you need to have a more a broader view on corruption in order to understand that kind of context in relation to corruption.
It's not that easy.
No.
What is corruption from your perspective?
I would agree with Måns, but we also use the Transparency International definition. Corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. And it could be active bribery, trying to bribe someone, or passive to receive. But it's also important that it doesn't have to be money. It could be something else that is important for that person. So it's not a question just about money. When we work in SALAR, we talk a lot about what is legal and unlegal, or not legal, but also what is proper and improper, because we're dealing with trust. And what is perceived as improper can cause damage to the society, even if it's still legal. So we try to work with all those.
So can it be a cultural thing, what people see as appropriate or not appropriate?
It could be a culture, and it's changing over time. It's not static. It's changed in Sweden over time. It changes in different sectors. I've just worked with the corruption for like 10, 15 years, but things are changing, and every generation have their view on what is corrupt and not. And hopefully it's, in some ways, it's a stricter view today, which is good when you handle when you are funded by public means.
Måns, you work at a research project in both Uzbekistan and Vietnam, and the one in Vietnam you do with ICLD.
Yes.
Is it possible to compare the work you do there with other countries?
I mean, our ambition is, of course, to create theories and concepts that can work in different contexts. At the same time, it's really important, like I said before, to understand the fact that corruption is not the same thing in Sweden as in Vietnam. There are similarities, but I would say it's more similarities between Uzbekistan and Vietnam than between Vietnam and Sweden. So, and also it's important to remember, I mentioned briefly earlier that the concept of corruption is created on a global level, where some actors are more powerful than others. And it's important to understand that we have designed the concept of corruption in a way where we can measure corruption in other cultures, but we haven't designed it really for understanding our own corruption as well. So I would say that it's, even though I don't do research on Sweden, I'm fairly confident that nepotism, for example, protecting friends and family in their careers, or the same sex in their career, exists in Sweden to a degree where you could describe it as corruption. Our laws does not support that view completely. So therefore, I agree very, very much with what you said, Cecilia, about not being too focused on law, but try also to understand corruption from what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And that differs between Vietnam and Sweden. In Vietnam, you need to take into account that schools would not function. Children will not be able to go to schools if the informal economy did not support the schools with money. We wouldn't accept that in Sweden, and we don't need that in Sweden. But we need to be a bit humble in relation, when talking about other legal cultures and other nations, we need to be a bit humble that their way of running society differs from our way.
May I just add something? According to at least one of the researchers I know, corruption in Sweden is also flying a little bit underneath the radar, and it's not picked up in these international surveys because they tend to focus on the national level, and many situations that are vulnerable from a corruption perspective is happening at the local level in Sweden. I mean, a lot of procurements, permits been issued, and inspections being carried out. So I think the surveys that are being made might not give the full picture, one might argue.
I don't fully disagree there, but because I think you also have to see that the local and regional level in Sweden is very strong. Sweden is different than where we have the right to levy taxes, and we are the largest employer organization. So of course there are corruption, but in the last years the really big cases has been on the national level. But of course there are problems on the local level as well, intentionally and non-intentionally. And I think that is what we have to work with in different ways, which we have. Because a lot of the work being done on a local and regional level is working with people. And there you have to get the employees to understand how to act and not, and that's the organization's responsibility. So you don't put people in a position when they maybe do the wrong things because they don't really know.
But what would you say are the laws and norms that can create a safe society?
Yeah, if I were to say something about why Sweden, because I think Sweden is one of the cleaner countries in relation to corruption in the world. And the reason for that is perhaps also, besides what's been mentioned here before, is also the fact that we have a large overlap of social norms and law, which means that our laws are supported by our informal social control. So it's expected from not only from law, but also from your colleagues, your friends, your neighbors, that you should not involve in corrupt activities. So, and this is not only in relation to corruption; it's of course in relation to law on a more in the larger picture. So that means that we have a support. Laws are legit in Sweden in ways that they are not legit in Uzbekistan and Vietnam, perhaps. The citizen contract with the state is stronger in Sweden, and the informal control therefore works more effectively. And in fact, people don't follow the law. No one walks around and thinks about what does the law say. How big is the risk that someone will discover what I'm doing, and what will the punishment be? So people don't do that. Criminals do, but regular people don't. They do what they think is expected from them by people in their environment. We are social creatures, so we act upon what we think is the correct way according to people around us. So therefore, the informal control and the social norms becomes really, really important in supporting laws. So laws are held up by social norms in society. And in other societies where there is a gap between the social control, the informal social control and the formal social control, between informal norms and laws, when the gap is too large, you will see informal structures and corruption take place to a higher degree, I think.
But still, it's not given forever. So I think every country, every society have to work with this on a continuous basis, because trust have to be built over and over again. And Sweden luckily has a strong both horizontal trust between people and vertical trust between the citizens and the authorities. But hard times, tougher economy, when there are troubles in society, that is challenged. So you have to work with this. I think all societies stand for that challenge.
It's a huge challenge.
It's a huge challenge, yeah.
Because it's also about attitudes, as you mentioned now, with how we see laws and how we follow them or not following them.